Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Forum. And thank you, everyone, for taking out time on a Saturday evening to sort of hear all of us out. I think the reason why we have chosen this topic is because there are obviously a lot of changes that are taking place both from a legal and regulatory perspective to take into account and ease the process of doing business in India in these difficult times. And we would want this session to be as interactive as possible rather than it being sort of a one-sided dialogue. So even if you have questions as we go along from topic to topic, please feel free to sort of post it and we will be happy to respond live. So I think moving on, I think we've broken up this presentation into sort of two segments. One is more generic in nature in terms of the practical challenges on contract execution and filings with SEBI and the problems that people are facing and how whether you can deal with it or whether these challenges will continue to persist. We are going to be giving you some of our sort of learnings on the ground, and that's one aspect. The second aspect is more on fund terms and some of the circulars that SEBI has come out with and how to tackle those. And that's something that Vivek and I are going to be talking through, followed by Atreya, who is going to be taking up more of the challenges that are being faced at the portfolio company level by fund managers, and how some of those issues can be tackled. So I think let's just sort of start off. I think on the first aspect is a question that is sort of coming up and has been coming up, given that in Maharashtra, the lockdown may potentially get extended and has been going on for some time now. A lot of people have been asking us that, how do we stamp documents? Is there a process by which we can do a e-stamping? Within how much time does a document need to necessarily get stamped? What are the penalties that may be imposed if stamp duty is not paid within a certain time period, so on and so forth. So just very quickly taking you through, the critical aspects. Now, obviously, Stamp Act varies from state to state. So we'll be sticking to the Maharashtra Stamp Act. And that sort of very clearly states that, if you have a document which is unstamped or inadequately stamped, then it is not admissible as evidence. Now, what are the usual modes of stamping that we see and what can you do in the current situation? So obviously the first one is the more physical way of procuring stamp paper, which is the non-judicial stamp paper. Now, obviously, as things stand today, obtaining those stamp paper is definitely next to impossible in Maharashtra. There may be some states where these stamp papers are available and where the lockdown has eased up significantly. But as I understand, Maharashtra continues to face this challenge. The other one is obviously what we typically call franking. But unfortunately, that is also an application that needs to go to a bank. Somebody has to physically procure it. And there is a stamp, there is a limit on the amount that you can get a document franked for, and that's 5,000 rupees. The other one is SBTR, which is what I understand most people are sort of going for, which is you make an online application and the challan is sort of printed on a government stationery, which is a format which the government has prescribed. The only downside there is that somebody actually has to go and physically procure that piece of paper that is generated. But again, given banks have been open as a part of essential services, that's still something that is doable. The other one is where you actually don't need to go physically and obtain this. There is a e-challan which is issued, which is GRAS. That's very similar to the e-STBR stamp duty procuring exercise. The only issue there is that that only applies to documents which are required to be registered, compulsory registered under Section 17 of the Registration Act. And therefore, in terms of some of the documents that we execute, particularly at the fund level, may not fall under this. So e-STBR has been something that that we are seeing more and more people use. I think once the lockdown eases out, given it's not that even after the lockdown gets over, the fear in people's mind of catching the virus will sort of reduce, and therefore e-STBR may still continue to be a valid sort of option. Just wanted to check with Atreya, for example, what are you seeing at the portfolio level in terms of sort of stamping of documents?
So I'll talk about in relation to the investment agreements maybe parties are entering into, or where PE funds are making investments or signing up into new documents. So at least for those, we have seen parties getting stamp papers in other states where there is a nexus in terms of the portfolio company or maybe the fund manager's office. So a couple of deals that we have signed in the last couple of months, Delhi has been a preferred sort of jurisdiction where parties have managed to get stamp papers. And with that basis, we have been able to sort of get executions done at an investment into the portfolio company level.
Okay. Vivek, any learnings that you have had with e-STBR or any other sort of stamp duty procurements in Maharashtra in particular? Because I understand Delhi has been, far better for most of us here when we execute, for example, contribution agreements. Those are always executed in either Delhi or in Bangalore, where the stamp duty problem has not been so much. So anything, any learnings from Maharashtra?
Sure. So yeah, so I totally agree, Pallavi. On the agreement level, definitely, given that one or the other party, including the trustees, mostly have their presence, local presence in Delhi as a jurisdiction, it is always a preferred option. In these times, because Delhi as a state has more options available as compared to Maharashtra, because there is also an e-stamping concept there, which is more prevalent and more readily available. Besides that, I think from a fund standpoint, as opposed to agreements where, on a practical note, we have seen most funds getting stuck is at the level of getting their trust deeds registered and executed and finalized in that sense. And there it has been a real challenge because, what the AIF regulations, as you know, would prescribe is that to go in for a final approval as a registration, or rather an application to be tendered in for a final registration with SEBI for an AIF, what is really required is a registered trustee. But the workaround for that, in fact, in some cases suggested by SEBI itself, has been to tender in an in-principle approval application. So I think purely from a stamp duty standpoint, yes, within the state of Maharashtra, this continues to be an issue. And, I would tend to agree with you and Atreya that perhaps a more easy practical fix to the situation or this particular issue is that probably given that one of the parties would have a base in Delhi, prefer Delhi as a jurisdiction if possible.
Okay. The other more sort of practical challenge that I would like to sort of discuss is obviously execution, historically also obviously wet signatures have been a preferred mode of signing. To be honest, there is the only reason for it is that it is very difficult for the party to prove that they actually hadn't signed the document. So from an evidentiary perspective, that becomes primary evidence and therefore difficult to refute for the party who's questioning that the contract was not entered into. Now, obviously in COVID times, it's difficult for people to go and travel to a office and all of the parties meet together and do a wet signature. Now, some of the options that we have seen people do is obviously use DSC. Now, that is a mode of signature which is specifically recognized under the IT Act. There are some documents, unfortunately, which cannot be executed. For example, power of attorneys cannot be, any wills or testamentary succession documents cannot be. So leaving those aside, the one mode which I am seeing as a more preferred method, which has also been historically the case, is effectively execute. So you scan the document, you put a wet signature on, you print the document, put a wet signature on it, and after that you scan it and upload it. And as and when the lockdown opens, you sort of collect all the original signatures and put it into the document, and that is sort of then validly executed. So that does not sort of curtail the execution process, because if you want to execute today, you are still able to. And at the same time, because the original signatures will still be there, it's useful because the physical signatures will also be collated at some point and kept. So at least that's the mode of execution that I'm seeing typically. I don't know, Atreya, on the downstream side, how are executions taking place?
No, I agree with you. So I think instead of the DSC mode, it's mostly the e-scan and then exchange the signature pages with the parties. Because a couple of deals that have signed for us, even though we did get sort of stamp papers printed in Delhi, but they have not been able to be couriered across jurisdictions for parties to sign. So as of now, they're all sort of e-signed. So you print the signature page, scan it to each party, have those ready, and then whenever lockdown ends, the instruction is for them to be collated and couriered for the originals to be collated.
Yeah. Now, there's another question which we have been getting is that, if, for example, I don't have all the sort of a scanner and, be able to sort of, do this entire process. If I exchange an email attaching the document and saying that, okay, this is the contract, and I accept the terms of the contract, and the other party also sort of does the same thing, is that valid execution? Now, there are judgments which have come out on this very topic, which in a way blesses the fact that if the email was very specific and clearly stated the fact that there was an acceptance of the terms of the attached contract, then that is valid execution. But just my personal view on this, and I would request Vivek and Atreya to also share their views, is that, see, I think at the end of the day, signing a document is really still not a requirement to have a valid contract. You can have an oral contract as well today. What we try to do as parties and lawyers are reduce the questions that may come up in terms of whether this contract was validly entered into or not. And tomorrow somebody denying they having actually executed something like this or agreeing to some of the terms of the contract, and all kinds of other issues that may come. So I am personally still not so much in favor of this process. I think the process that we have highlighted previously would still be a more conservative and a safer approach to take when executing documents.
No, I agree with you, Pallavi. I think one point also to bear in mind is, whoever is authorized to sign as the board resolution or sort of the authorization for the entity that is signing, those resolutions also need to be carefully looked at to see if the authorization is just for signature or to agree with an email form that Pallavi you were describing. So at least even from a certainty of signature or agreement perspective, it may be preferable to have scanned signature pages exchanged as opposed to just getting emails exchanged off the parties from an authorization perspective.
Okay, thank you for that. So Vivek, would you now like to move on to the fund related sort of challenges? I see there are a couple of questions which have come on. Maybe, I think one of the questions is, currently a bank is issuing bank guarantees on their letterhead since stamp paper is out of stock, stating in issuance or extension will provide once the stamp paper is available. Sorry, I am not really following this question. Vivek or Atreya?
There is also a follow-up question from Sumit, right? Where he's saying that the beneficiary doesn't agree on the bank letterhead and is looking for invocation. Does this matter? So I think, Sunit, the only question that you need to sort of understand is a stamp paper is going to be relevant if this bank guarantee is going to be adjudicated upon or you're going to submit it as evidence to a court during this lockdown period. Of course, if the bank is saying that they will re-execute this on a stamp paper whenever the lockdown ends and they are going to procure it. So the risk that you're running between now and then is just the question of whether you want to enforce it. Barring that, as Pallavi was also explaining, from an intent of execution perspective, it should be enough if it's not on a stamp paper but executed by the bank, if that's your question.
Okay, so thanks for that. We can, I think, move on. Vivek, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, Pallavi. So I'm on slide 4 just for reference. And this is essentially a topic I would just want to go a little bit into the background and then probably bring in Pallavi's views so that we can completely cover the practical perspective around it also. And this essentially deals with one of the more core fund documents, which is the private placement memorandum, which SEBI through its original regulations, the AIF regulations, which is the most relevant platform today for any domestic fund, really expects that the PPM has all the material disclosures. So there is some guidance already in the AIF regulations with regard to what the PPM mandately should have. However, what has happened recently this year in February is that SEBI has come up with a much more detailed format, which runs almost in some 45 to 50 pages for category 1 and category 2 AIFs as one format and a second format for category 3 AIFs. And the intent of SEBI really behind these formats is to make sure that all the relevant disclosures are going into the PPM with respect to a fund by the fund manager, because SEBI really feels that the PPM has to be the document where the investor should really look at as a first port of call for all the relevant information, not just about the fund, but potentially all the conflicts and many other relevant issues in that sense. So what SEBI has done is that, and of course, the industry was looking at many versions of the PPM when they were filing with SEBI. And SEBI also had this administrative issue of looking at all of those versions and probably not having something standardized. So, that is really the problem that SEBI has tried to address through this particular format. Now, there are a few important practical considerations that emerge for the next fund that would be launched, post this particular circular, as compared to any previous funds that probably you as fund managers would have run, is that because of the specific entries and the specific guidance as to what disclosures have to go in each of the formats, there is a sort of an additional thinking that really needs to go into the new funds that have to adhere to this particular format, which became effective March 1, 2020. So I would emphasize this point by sort of two examples that I feel are very relevant, and where I've seen fund managers also having higher dialogue with us as lawyers to understand how we should address this issue, or rather fulfill this particular address this particular rather fulfill this particular requirement. So the first one that I would like to take is the disclosures related to side letters. Now, with regard to side letters, what has happened is that, of course, there was previously side letter clauses in the PPM, which were, subject to each fund manager's requirements, customized, and disclosures were made around side letters. But the SEBI officers really felt that there was a lot that was not being said. And now the side letter has a lot of additional restrictions and a lot of additional considerations that are being brought up. So the fundamental point here is that SEBI has gone to the length of even saying that there are items to which you cannot, under side letters, offer differential rights, and these are really exemptions to your core fund obligations as a contributor with reference to your give back obligations. So you can't really differentiate or provide differential rights to investors specifically under side letters for, let's say, give back obligations, indemnification obligations, or promise to an investor to give an early exit in comparison to the other investors. So these are quite important points in that sense to bear in mind at the drafting stage for the fund document. One more example that I would like to take to again re-emphasize the importance of this format and how it has really led to fund managers and lawyers think a little bit extra, as compared to what was happening pre the circular, is the example of the successor fund. So, fund managers, in a very classical, typical situation, fund houses would always want to roll on to the next fund within a differential or within a gap of around 3 to 4 years, really to keep that management fee stream coming in, and really keeping that sustainability in that sense for their management entity or the fund houses. Now, the successor fund disclosure is something that often got skipped, in my opinion. And there were some fund managers who were making these disclosures. There were very selective definitions that were adopted with regard to successor funds, and there was actually no real constraints that was prescribed under the regulations. It was all very voluntary. However, now SEBI has come up and on this specific point expected at least on 4 or 5 counts specific affirmative disclosures to be made. So that's really the importance of the format. It's the key takeaway is that it is much more elaborate. It's much more critical to comply with this format, because a contravention of the format can really be viewed as a contravention of the circular, because there's a circular that SEBI has issued to prescribe this particular format. The second sort of important aspect of the circular is that SEBI has mandated an annual audit of the PPM terms. So effectively, there would be an internal or an external auditor who would really vouch for whether the PPM terms have been really complied with by the fund manager or not, and make a list of the differential, or rather prepare a report as to what deviances are there in the practical do's of the fund, or the practical deeds of the fund, and really what was expected under the PPM. And that report has to go to SEBI, it has to go to the trustee, and in a way, it would automatically also transition to investors. So that again is a very important thing to bear in mind when writing your PPMs, because there is really accountability in that sense, not probably at the end of the fund term where, let's say, an investor would really pick this issue up and file a complaint with SEBI, but really on an annual basis where an auditor in his report would be highlighting this. So that is also one very important aspect which really adds to more credence to what the PPM disclosures already have. And the third important aspect with regard to, and this is something very interesting, and it has led to really some creative solutions being required from us as lawyers, and also some very practical challenges in terms of preparing the fund documents for fund managers and us alike. SEBI has said now that, irrespective of the nomenclature of the contribution agreement or the subscription agreement, the terms of the subscription agreement or the contribution agreement should not really go beyond what is there in the PPM. And this again has led to some really interesting issues and really interesting implications, because contribution agreement being the agreement would have inherently a lot of terms, for example, representations and warranties of the parties, which would ordinarily not go in the PPM as such, because even the SEBI PPM format does not expect representation and warranties to really go in that sense. One good part about our engagement with SEBI, and I think Pallavi can really weigh in, because I know along with many industry associations, Pallavi has been very active on discussions with regard to this particular issue and this particular circular with SEBI, is that SEBI has said that they would not really see the side letter as being a contravention to the fund documents of this particular circular, so long the side letter really adheres to the disclosure thresholds that are prescribed under the circular. And finally, I think there is an exemption granted from these conditions to angel funds and to funds who effectively have investors making commitments north of 70 crore rupees or $10 million, depending upon the currency of commitment. However, even in those situations, the last condition that I mentioned, that the terms of the contribution agreement cannot really go beyond the terms of the PPM, is something that SEBI has re-emphasized. So, Pallavi, I would really want to bring you in from a practical standpoint as to what sort of challenges and what sort of issues you are seeing with respect to your new fund documents, because I know you are dealing both on the regulatory front with SEBI and trying to get more reforms and sort of more clarifications from SEBI on this front, and also you are also active on a lot of matters where these issues are becoming relevant.
Sure. Thanks, Vivek. So, couple of things on compliance with the fifth circular. One, which is, who does this apply to? Because what they have stated in the circular is that come March 1, 2019, this circular is applicable. Now, does this then therefore apply even to funds which did their initial close before March 1, 2019 and currently are still in fundraise mode? Now, there are sort of informal clarifications that we have received from SEBI saying that if you are not fundamentally changing the terms of the PPM and are only looking to maybe modify some specific clauses, then you don't need to migrate to the new PPM in its entirety. For example, if you have an existing registered AIF and you plan to do a new launch of a scheme, then in that context, post March 1, 2019, you will need to comply with that template PPM, obviously subject to you obtaining the waiver. Now, in most cases, the waiver is difficult to obtain because the threshold is very high. And you will have investors who will be lower than the 70 crore or the 10 million number. Now, the other issue that we are seeing people grapple with is the requirement to do an audit. And even though the SEBI has said it can be an internal audit of the PPM, but there is no timeline which has been prescribed by when this audit needs to be done. And within what time frame does this need to be submitted to SEBI and to investors and to trustee, etc. Now, I think a lot of people have been writing to SEBI saying that this should become, this should be waived for this year, because obviously undertaking an audit requires a lot of information to come in from portfolio companies as well, which gathering people and getting the data and then doing the reporting might be a challenging exercise. We don't know whether SEBI is going to take that up favorably or just maybe defer the timeline. But that's something that we understand people are contemplating and have been requesting SEBI for some kind of relaxation. The other one is this: the contribution agreement cannot have any terms which are over and above what is there in the PPM. And just in that context, at least the approach that we feel should be adopted is make adequate references to the contribution agreement in the PPM, because we understand that SEBI would appreciate the fact that a contribution agreement is a contract and therefore will have terms which the PPM will not carry. So it will not have an arbitration clause, it will not have your typical reps and warranties, it will not have indemnity clauses. So a lot of these things, the way in which you take consent of investors, notices sections, there will be a whole host of sections which will be there in a contribution agreement which you otherwise won't find in the PPM, because that is still considered a marketing document. Therefore, I think it's important that the critical provisions, particularly in your summary of principal terms, that should have enough references to the contribution agreement to say that if you are elaborating on something in the contribution agreement, please ensure that that is in no way contradictory. And if it is in addition, then make a reference in the PPM to the contribution agreement, highlighting that this specific provision or the contribution agreement has information on this particular topic which is over and above. We don't know if this gets tested out with SEBI, how this plays out, but definitely this is more to do from how to tackle this more from a practical perspective, because just replicating the contribution agreement the way it stands into the PPM is definitely going to be a challenging exercise, which I don't think anybody would like to go down the path on. I think these are, the key sort of issues. Of course, there is the whole performance benchmarking. There is no agency which has been identified yet on who will be undertaking this performance benchmarking, how this is going to be rolled out. So there are lots of questions which are coming on in that. We suspect that timeline is going to get extended because most importantly, even if fund managers are gathering that information, they still don't know which agency is going to be the one from whom they need to obtain this benchmarking. So that's sort of on wait and watch mode, and we'll have to wait and see how that gets rolled out.
Thank you for those comments. So I think then we can move on to slide number 5, which essentially is sort of a precipitation of a few learnings that we want to just discuss along with the participants on the call, from the current situation. So just to take a step back, everybody knows, what has really hit us. It's really unprecedented in that sense. It has led to the central bank of our country to effectively come out and say that, there is a moratorium for, for an extended period of 6 months that the NBFCs and banks can grant. And that really speaks about that situation in the financial world or the economic world has really been on a standstill. Literally, the entire wheel of the economy has been just jammed along in some sort of a jerk, right? So therefore, there is really sort of a standstill kind of a situation. Now, given the way our AIF regulations are worded, there are there are always disclosures and milestones, important milestones to the fund which are time bound. So, for example, in the PPM, you are as a fund manager are expected to mention what is the fundraising period through an outer timeline to your final closing as a fund that you would undertake, right? Beyond which you would not expect fresh commitments. Similarly, you have to also mention what would be the investment period or the commitment period during which the commitments of the investors could be called and the investments out of those commitments could be made. And then finally, of course, as the AIF regulations prescribe for most close-ended funds, and in fact for all AIFs in that sense, it really has to be a product which can't be in perpetuity. So there has to be a finite timeline associated with the AIF. Now, specifically for AIFs, which are nearing the end of their fundraising period but have not really been able to raise commitments in, let's say, 2019 and were really hoping to close deals in 2020, or funds which are looking to close deals, deploy deals because their commitment periods are coming to an end, or in the alternative, let's say funds who are hoping to liquidate because this was rather the penultimate or the ultimate year of their existence, the fund itself, of all of the portfolio investments, there has been a really in that sense a difficult time that has faced the fund and the fund managers. So there are situations that we are seeing where fund managers are willing now to go and talk to the investors that look, there is a real important need to sort of discuss that, perhaps a 6 month kind of a timeline, or let's say a year, has literally gone down the drain. The fund has really not been able to act upon its plan, and we really need some more time. And in that sense, the SEBI requirements to extend the fundraising period or extend the commitment period or extend the term of the fund, it comes into picture. Now, given the way the regulations are framed for extension of the term of the commitment period or for the fundraising period, because they would form a part of the PPM, and also because of the regulations, in one way or the other, there is a probability that the investor approval requirement would kick in, and it would really depend on what exactly is the change that is expected to be undertaken with regard to the fund, or rather which timeline has to be extended as to what that proportion would be. But in all cases, it would be either 66% of investor representation by value of the investments or 75%, followed by probably a SEBI, followed by sort of a SEBI review or depending upon what exactly the change is. Now, the important point for fund managers to engage in along with their advisors for their next fund is really that where all they can retain maximum flexibilities with regard to these points. So that, I think, is one very important learning which will go down now in fund documents under a more sort of reviewed and a more thoughtful manner as it was done previously. Uh, the next point that I would sort of want to touch upon is situations where fund managers sitting on dry powder and commitments are now wanting to explore opportunities beyond their current strategies. So this is a classical situation, right? So I would take an example, a regular example of, let's say, a category 2 AIF, which under the SEBI platform can pretty much cater to a very, very wide range of strategies. However, at the time of preparation of the fund documents, the manager was very clear. Let's say the manager wanted to do only real estate investment, and he did not want to do any sort of allied sector or anything outside the realm of real estate in that sense. However, it may happen in future, as it is happening currently, that because of extraneous circumstances or for any other reasons, there might be an opportunity which might come up in an allied sector or in a sector which is not uh, fitting in strictly into the descriptions of the PPM. And one must remember that for those changes as well, there is an investor approval requirement that comes up. So the one important learning that at least I have seen from my conversations with fund managers who want to explore those opportunities which are not strictly within the terms of the PPM is to remember that most of the funds really have the flexibility of making investments under the AIF regulations, catering to a very wide range of strategy, depending on, of course, what sub classification one chooses. And it is really important for the PPM not to literally tie you down. And that is really one important learning because of this unprecedented times. I would also want to take the one particular regulation from the AIF regulations as my next point, which is around the important policies, right? So the business of funds would typically have, let's say, an insider trading policy, given it's the way funds work, or a conflict of interest mitigation policy. These are some very core policies. However, the pandemic has really put into the center stage the importance of BCP policies. And I would again want to emphasize on this point, take a practical example. So in one of the situations, what's happening is that one of our clients, because of a very stringent key person event clause, is really facing that on account of some other disputes with the investors might really make or rather trigger the contractual key person event clause, simply because of the mobility restrictions that are happening around, and simply because of the fund managers and the fund employees and the fund entities as such's inability to really act in these times, because the initial period of the lockdown was really a period of uncertainty. So there is some sense of fear for some that might come up in some cases where, let's say, a key person event clause would be read more stringently than what it deserves in a fair world. So that, I believe, is a very important critical aspect or a learning for us. And fund managers should really look at having a business continuity policy as a policy which is adopted and disclosed to the investors, so that tomorrow if something like this hits, let's say a lockdown or a act of God or a pandemic or whatever it is, where there is a genuine case for the for the fund managers not being able to discharge their duties in the real as it would be happening prior to those extraneous circumstances or special situations, there is at least no contractual breach or any specific term where one at the time of drafting would not have really thought about those situations that comes and hits them unexpectedly. And that, I believe, is a very important and a critical aspect, because currently, as you would see, most of the people are working from home. Most of the people are not being able to do stuff that they would have ordinarily done on ground. And a lot of fund management, monitoring of portfolio investments, etc., would have expected that to happen depending on the situation. So that is, I think, one more important point. So again, I think, Pallavi, if you could share with the group your sort of experience and the learnings that you really see that we as lawyers and fund managers should bear in mind for whatever next we do post this lockdown or post this pandemic.
Sure. So I think one thing which, as a sort of feedback that we are getting from fund managers, is that it's important not to be opportunistic during this time, and not try to corner LPs into giving concessions, even though it is not required, simply because you can. So it's better to keep that perspective in mind, that don't take opportunistic decisions. If you truly really require it and you're able to justify the reason why a change is being sought, it's only in those situations ideally that any rights of this nature, the ones that Vivek highlighted, should be exercised. A couple of sort of live problems that we are seeing. One obviously is, and this is not new to the pandemic, it's been going on for some time, which is where existing venture capital funds which were operating under the VCF regulations, they have not been able to wind up their operations in a time-bound manner per law, because law only gives you 3 months to wind up your fund and make distributions once the term gets over. And there are sort of judgments which have come out. Which, for example, there is a CIG Realty judgment, there is a Cinema Ventures Fund judgment, which are not very helpful in situations where genuinely a fund manager, say for example, has litigations going on or arbitrations going on, or an IBC process in a portfolio company has gone into IBC, where for reasons which are beyond its control at some level, the assets are not being able to be liquidated, and it's not even possible to do an in specie, and they are stuck. So again, there are representations being made to SEBI to be able to allow such funds to go on for a slightly longer duration than what has been prescribed under law today. even for those whose fund is coming to an end in, say, for example, March, April, or even during this pandemic, a lot of them had, positions that, that the portfolio company was going for a listing and they would have gotten an exit from that. But we all know what is the situation of the markets right now. And therefore, many of these exits are stuck. Now, in these kind of situations, what does a fund manager do if they've not taken an extension and they're in the 3-month period? So that is one topic of discussion that we are seeing across a lot of funds. The other one obviously is unfortunately on defaults. Not so much, happening across the globe, but definitely happening in the Indian context, and particularly more with, ultra HNIs and HNIs whose capitals have been significantly eroded or their priorities have changed, and therefore they are not willing to fund their portion of the commitment. Now, what do you do in those situations? Now, our contracts will usually have default clauses, but say, for example, a situation where an investor has not met the 1 crore minimum that has been prescribed by SEBI as contribution amount from an investor, then what do you do in that situation? Now, typically, our contracts will have the usual laundry list of actions that a fund manager can take if a default happens: charge a penalty, charge an interest, take away voting rights, and so on and so forth. But I think it's becoming critical as we see that it's important to put in provisions in terms of how an investor will be treated if they don't pay the 1 crore amount, how an investor is going to be treated once they're declared a defaulter, and specifically lay out the fact that their expenses are going to be reduced. They will only get their money back at the end of the term, because a lot of these investors expect that if they've told you that they will stop paying, then you should return their money therein and there. And if you don't, then that there are SEBI on scores, you will get questions, and there will be letters coming your way. So I think it's becoming critical and more important to focus on default clauses very specifically and deal with these kind of situations. It's not so much applicable to fund managers who are dealing with a couple of investors, say, for example, but the ones which are more broad-based in nature, I think definitely, we are seeing that is a clause which needs more rethinking. The other one is very surprising. I mean, it's not very surprising, but a lot of people who are making requests for, say, for example, extension of the commitment period or the fundraise period to their advisory board or to their investors, they're not getting any form of response. Now, what do you do in a situation like that? Do we build in deemed consent contractually and specifically make investors sign and agree to the fact that if they don't respond within a certain time period, then it is going to be taken as a yes? What do you do in a situation where even your limited advisory board members are not willing to give you a response, and despite chasing multiple times, there is nothing which is forthcoming? So in that situation, fund managers are stuck, because while they want to extend and time is running out, if they don't receive a response at all, then what do they do in that situation? Not do an extension at all. I think those are the kind of things that need sort of more thinking through. The other one which we are realizing is, say, for example, even clauses which need amendment, which do not affect anybody negatively, and it's a standard course amendment process. Investors are sort of turning a blind eye and not executing those contracts when they come up for an amendment. So now the question is that, should we compulsorily put in a POA, a power of attorney? What kind of language should that power of attorney have, such that the investors don't feel that, anything can be amended without their consent if their rights are impacted? So some of these things are, what we are seeing as fallouts of this pandemic, and a greater paranoia being associated with some of these things.
Thank you for that. And just as a last point from me on this slide, Pallavi, that you have touched upon the advisory board and the LP councils, that also has been now mandated as a part of the SEBI format. Of course, there is no compulsion on the fund manager to have those bodies for their funds, but of course there is a need to think. And one interesting thought that at least come across my mind is that today there are a lot of fund managers who want to take aggressive or rather bold decisions to salvage their portfolio companies, to help their portfolio companies in these difficult times, because there is really a merit in that sort of empathy, despite the fiduciary hat that they are wearing vis-a-vis their investors. But there is really in that sense some sort of a skeptical environment as to what step of the manager, or rather what liberty is granted by the manager to the portfolio company, let's say by way of a moratorium or an exemption temporarily from any service, interest service or a debt service kind of an obligation, would really be seen, let's say in hindsight 2 or 3 years later, as contravention of fiduciary duty. And in that sense, an interesting thought that come across my mind at least is what could really be merit in exploring the option of having a balanced external independent member driven advisory council or an advisory board that can not only just give value in terms of ideas and sort of guidance to the fund managers in such difficult times, but also add credence to their decisions, because the ppm and the fund documents can only be say so much, and there would be left a lot to the discretion of the manager, who are really going to drive the fund in unprecedented and in times like these. And it would really make a lot of sense for fund managers to bounce those decisions off through those independent members and really get their value, because I think from a dispute standpoint, in hindsight, getting those decisions or getting those actions, a plan of actions blessed or rather discussed or sort of approved by these external independent agencies like an LP council or an advisory board could really be very important, very useful. So
thanks Vivek for that. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think with that, I would rest this part of the presentation and hand it over to Atreya. And as mentioned earlier, if there are any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. We'll be happy to take them now or during a Q&A session in the end. Thank you. Over to you, Atreya.
Thanks, Vivek. So I'll just build on in terms of the concepts that Pallavi and Vivek touched upon. So I think I'll break it up into two parts. One is where, for example, Vivek said there is dry powder and the funds want to invest. What are we seeing in the market in terms of whether deals are going ahead, what type of clauses the investors are looking for as protections. And then the second part that I would touch upon is what is happening in terms of existing investments in portfolio companies. In the situations that again Pallavi and Vivek touched upon as to, for example, if there's a funding requirement that's there in the portfolio companies, are the investors going ahead with the funding, or for example, if there's been a default vis-a-vis the promoters, is it that the investors are going ahead with discussions, or it's a combination of the default and stuff like that. So I think just in the first part, in a situation where, for example, there is investment to be made by a fund, it's not just enough for parties to find a portfolio company and to sign definitive agreements, right? So there's a question of value protection between signing and closing. And also if fundamentally the assets undergo a change in value or nature because of what we are seeing in the market and the economy, whether we still want to go ahead with the investment as a fund. So I think most of the documents that are being signed now in terms of new agreements being executed, there's a lot of negotiation that's happening on the MAC clause, or what we call material adverse change clause. So in that, the question is, post signing, what kind of walkaway rights does a fund need to have in order to protect itself from having to go ahead with the deal at a valuation which may not work. So in that, I think there is one issue that is being debated in the legal circles, at least, is whether Contract Act provisions of frustration would be enough, or do we need additional protections from a MAC perspective in order to draft in specific clauses relating to the pandemic in order to have walkaway right. So I think mostly from an investor perspective, the documents that we are seeing signed now, rather than relying on sort of Contract Act provisions of frustration, which needs to go to, say, the fundamental root of the contract for a person to walk away from that deal. From a contractual perspective, there's a push to specifically include pandemics and COVID-19 situations from an investor perspective. And obviously there's a pushback from the other side. So I think the middle ground that we are seeing in the market is rather than calling out COVID-19 or pandemic, any sort of natural calamities or any sort of economic downturn which is caused by a natural calamity, is a broader sort of protection that investors are typically being okay with, as opposed to including specific language around COVID or the pandemic. And that's what is sort of the market currently for deals that are being signed as we speak. Moving on to what is happening in the context of defaults or existing rights that investors have in portfolio companies. I think what Vivek was also mentioning was, for example, if there's been a default in the pandemic or the lockdown situation, what do we do as a fund? So I think a couple of situations that we have faced live. Obviously, the way agreements at the portfolio level work is that typically if there's a default on the part of the promoter or the company, there are certain defined set of rights that an investor has, but there are also time periods associated with exercising those rights. So the question is, if the fund doesn't exercise those rights, is it a waiver of the fund's rights? And then how do you get protected going forward? So I think it is important from a fund perspective, if there is any sort of waiver or non-exercise of rights that are there in the sort of portfolio agreements, there has to be a recordal of the fact that this is an exemption being granted to the promoter because of the special situation that we are in, as opposed to this being looked upon as a waiver forever. So any sort of waivers or discussions that are going on with the promoter, it's important to document and preferably enter into amendment agreements at the portfolio level to make sure that this is not a waiver of the fund's rights like indefinitely. The other aspect that we are seeing a lot is what do we do in a situation where the portfolio company needs funds? And there are clauses in the investment documents that talks about a certain waterfall in terms of priority of funding rights that investors typically have. Now, I think the call that the fund managers are typically having to take now is, do I go ahead in a situation where it's uncertain as to how the business will play out and have greater exposure to a portfolio company, or do I insist on, go for bank funding or third-party lending? In which case, as fund equity investors, I will be sitting as sort of an inferior position compared to a new lender or a bank that may come in. But I think from what we are seeing in the market is typically funds are desisting or are apprehensive of funding more in existing portfolio companies, and they're pushing the companies more to go with banks or third-party lending that may be available in the market. Obviously, there are talks that are going on in the legal circles about defaulting companies from a bank perspective. There may be a moratorium under IBC in terms of banks being able to call a company into a dispute, a resolution of default, but that has still not been notified. Pending that, I think the question that an equity investor in a company should definitely bear in mind when it's signing off in terms of new debt funding that comes into the company is, do we want to really think about a situation where 1 year down the line, even if the moratorium is imposed under IBC, we may be sitting in a company which has a lot of leverage than what we had bargained for when we had come in. So that's a call that fund managers are having to take now. But notwithstanding the risk of over-leveraging at the portfolio level, the trend seems to be that third-party debt is a preferred option. So I'll pause here in terms of what's going on in the portfolio level at sort of pre-investment and post-investment stage. And maybe have some questions if there are any.
So there is one question from...
Yeah, there are some questions.
Yeah.
I think Pallavi has responded. Do you want to respond, Pallavi?
So if anyone has any question, please post it on the chat box. Those questions will be coming to me. I will read out the question. Is it fine?
Yeah, I mean, I saw there were a couple of questions which were asked, and I have already responded to those.
Yes.
I think one was in relation to the timeline for the PPM audit, and unfortunately there isn't any. So obviously, I know a lot of people are asking how to do this. So we are saying that if you've not done a first close at all, then I don't know what audit you can potentially do, because you wouldn't have started making any investments. You're still sort of raising funds. Now, once the first close happens, you would have started making investments, and the PPM thereafter becomes, in that sense, operational, because you would start undertaking activity as a fund once the initial close has taken place. So again, it's sort of, it's a judgment call that has been left to the fund managers. There's no timeline prescribed. So take a reasonable time. If you have not done any operations for the first 3 months, say for example, and it's mostly fundraising activity that you're undertaking, you can always tell SEBI that, we have not really done any of this, to the extent that the fundraising clauses need to be verified. The internal person can just confirm that those are being complied with, and the process as has been laid down in the PPM is being followed. We have still not started investing, so none of these clauses apply. So I'm just saying that it's more on a practical basis, how to approach it. See, what we need to understand is why this requirement for an internal audit came in. So in our discussions with SEBI, the understanding was that once the PPM is rolled out, there are enough representations that investors have made to SEBI where the allegation has been that fund managers just do their own thing after the product has been rolled out without really complying with the terms of the PPM at all. And sometimes they even change terms in the PPM without informing the investor. So, for example, they would have put in some diversification limits. They would have said that I will not invest in X type of company. I will do primarily unlisted investments, many conditions, which then, if you see over a period of time, are not met. I will not invest in my affiliates. I will take a specific consent that you need to take when you invest in an associate company. So a lot of these things have been happening in the market, and what SEBI wants is protection, that you are actually complying with the provisions that you have specified in your PPM. So there's no timeline prescribed, but what you need to ensure is that once the initial close is done and your fund is active and live, from then on you will just have to take a call on what is the kind of reporting that you need to do. And it should not be very difficult, because SEBI has said that this can be internal as well. So even your compliance team can actually be doing this, who are already doing, for example, the CTR which needs to be prepared, or monitoring portfolio companies. So at least to my mind, practically speaking, it should not be such a difficult task to do.
So there is one question from Nihal. I think you already responded, but the question was, any format of audit provided or any scope of audit? Hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the question from Nihal is, any format of audit provided or any scope of audit provided? I think you already answered that.
So the circular is clearly saying what you don't need to audit or what is optional. Like, for example, track record and things like that. Some of those things are optional, obviously, and the ones which are not optional, it just says, and there is no format. It's again, it's completely up to you how you want to frame it and how you want to sort of present it to SEBI. So there is no format prescribed, and what is excluded has been specifically provided in the circular.
That was one of the question. So if anyone has any queries, please post it on the chat box. Earlier, the chat box was disabled due to some activity reported. So if anyone has any questions, please post it on the chat box. I think there are no questions.
No,
there is one question.
Yeah, I I can see one. How can you see internal control perspective prescribed in India is different from international requirements? So if you are saying from a fund perspective, then obviously the international sort of protocols are more contract driven. There is a, in that sense, a model ILPA guidelines which have been laid down. Those are more sort of principles that can be adopted. They are not binding. Whereas what SEBI has done under the regulations and then subsequently under all the clarifications and Feb 5 circular, for example, that has come out, has sort of codified a lot of things which are not present in the international perspective. But again, from a contractual perspective, whether it is as an IC, the decision making advisory board, conflict section, typical decision making process, those are fairly sort of standard across the market. I don't know, Atreya, if you have anything on this from a portfolio level perspective.
No, I didn't fully follow the question, but is it a question in terms of governance, and do we want to
Yeah,
take
it
control
seems
as a
like a
fund?
question on governance.
Well, in terms of Indian regulations, I think control is pretty clear. So when a fund is coming into the portfolio company, there are 3 or 4 ways in which you can acquire control. One is becoming a majority shareholder or having sort of majority director appointment rights. Or we go through the list of veto items that a fund typically has vis-a-vis a promoter. And then the balance towards the investor being in control gets tilted if the items which are the veto items are more operational in nature. In terms of what we are seeing in the market, I can tell you, but I think the question was in terms of whether there's a difference in regulations internationally, but at least
Right.
at the portfolio level, I don't think there's much of a distinction between how another entity acquires control of another company, at least. So these are the 3-4 broad parameters. But just to round that off, I think in the market, it depends on whether you want to acquire control or not. I think the clients that we have typically seen going for control deals, I haven't seen a change in strategy for such clients, and vice versa for those that typically are okay with minority rights.
Yeah, I think just on a very high level, internationally, regulators across all prominent fund jurisdictions prefer to regulate not the fund but the fund managers. So the approach in India is rather contrarian in the sense that each fund has to really go submit its application, get registered with SEBI, predominantly as the intermediary in that sense. But globally, whether you look at Singapore or Mauritius or any other celebrated fund jurisdiction, the regulators really treat the manager as the intermediary in that sense and the entity which is answerable, and they really do not regulate as to what the manager is launching in terms of the product. So once the registration for the manager is there, the rule of thumb is that with minimum prescriptions and with minimum review, the fund would be launched, or rather a series of funds would be launched. I think that's really the genesis of why what Pallavi mentioned as to that internationally it's really the contract and the best principles around contract that really govern the entire question of fund governance. And in India it's a little different because we would not, at least I don't remember any other regulator coming up with sort of an elaborate 45 to 50 page format for the PPM, for example, internationally, if that just answers the question.
Okay, so there are 4-5 questions. I'll just read out. So the question from Sanjeev Verma: can the PPM process be done online going forward, or it requires physical documents?
PPM, I mean, I don't know what you mean by process, but if you're saying that, can I just share it with an investor over an email and get a confirmation from them that they have duly received it? I don't know. Practically, Vivek, that should not be an issue, right? If you are going to be sending it to, so obviously, private placement is something that you need to bear in mind. because AIF is a privately placed product, and therefore you can't have mass scale emails sort of going out to people just through distributors, and that's something that we see very frequently becoming a challenge. So as long as it's a it's an investor who and it's a one-on-one clear disclaimer provided sort of an email. I don't see a challenge in sending an email and obviously taking a confirmation from that investor that he's not going to sort of pass it on, and all of those things.
I would tend to agree with that. Subject to some do's and don'ts that you should comply with, just to make sure that the PPM doesn't really become a document readily available to the public at large. It should be possible to share the PPM with your investors over emails and get their consents with regard to the PPM.
Okay, the next question is, there are many requests for not charging management fees in line with moratorium. How are you dealing with it?
We are not dealing with it. I don't think that's an option for fund managers, predominantly because the operations are still active. There are still employees who are working. Deal sourcing is still taking place. So I don't know how anybody is going to be okay with waiving off management fees. So I don't see that being an option. At least not to my knowledge, and not the clients that I am dealing with have had these requests.
Okay, next question is from Anubha. Her question is, with regards to the annual audit of PPM, since there is no clarity given by SEBI for the mode of submission of the audit report and you did for submission, do you think audit can be deferred? And also, what is the range of the fee that is being charged typically for such audits?
So, see, when a submission has to go to SEBI, it is typically done online to your relevant case officer, or even to the deputy general manager. I don't know whether the website where you upload your AIF application, whether that has an audit tab or not. But assuming it does not, most of the applications are typically, there is typically a physical filing that does take place. Now, obviously, in the situation that we are in, if a physical submission is not possible, then we are recommending everybody to just do just send an email to your case officer who you would have dealt with, highlighting that, this is not possible physically, and therefore, we are submitting the report over email. Now, can you defer it to next year? Legally, the circular applies from March 1, 2019. So therefore, there is nothing legally to say that this will not apply this year. There are representations which some clients are making, saying that this year is going to be very difficult to do, and we can wait and see if SEBI comes back with something or not. But as of now, it's not that they have extended the timeline on this from March 1, 2019 to something else. It still continues to be applicable.
Okay, next question is from Leelavati. What good practice do you advise the fund managers to maintain or follow during the situation? Because fund managers need to prove that fiduciary responsibility, and at other hand deal with investee company with cash crunch. Changes are there may not be a good performance and clients raising complaints.
So Atriya, are you seeing anything specifically that fund managers are doing differently in while making investments than usual? Like, for example, one of the questions that I am seeing is because they're not able to sort of get a third party buyer. They're asking if we can purchase the units, or can we purchase the asset, or can my affiliate purchase the asset? And those are very clear-cut conflict type of situations. Now, how do you see these kind of situations, and should a fund manager be engaging in something like this, or what are the kind of things that we can do to get effective exits in this kind of a situation?
Yeah, I'll break it up. I think the question was also talking about cash crunch for the portfolio company. So that is something I touched upon. Obviously, for a promoter that needs cash in a situation like this, the first port of call that we are seeing in the market is for them to go to the existing investor. Because going to the market or going to the banks to raise funding right now is difficult. Existing investors we are seeing are being facilitated, but not in all cases are they going ahead with the request for funding that is coming in from the promoter. Because a lot of cases, the funds that we deal with at least are offshore funds in a lot of cases, in which case there are various FEMA restrictions that come in terms of whether they can deploy debt. In terms of further equity exposure, I don't think private equity funds are keen to get exposure into companies in these few months that we are talking about. So, and then I think you asked something about exits.
Yes.
So right now, all discussions of exits, I think, are being postponed from what I'm seeing in the portfolio company level. So if at all there was an obligation on the promoter to give an exit to a private equity fund, there have been talks about extension, and which is why the point I made is that if at all the funds are agreeing to go ahead with an extension that is being requested by the promoter, it's important to record that this is not a waiver of my rights forever, but this is an amendment that I am sort of obliging the promoter with for a defined time period. And then we will again have to come to the table to relook at what we can and cannot do. But yeah, there are requests that are coming in, and I think the fund managers are being reasonable in terms of obliging the promoters with requests for extensions and granting them such, subject to these caveats that this is not forever.
So I think even at the fund level, I think it's more critical than ever that you keep continuous dialogue with your investors. Because what you're doing at the portfolio level, and should there be any changes in terms, etc., that you are doing, obviously we don't, because it's a privately pooled vehicle in that sense, a lot of the nitty-gritties are not communicated to investors, but at least to keep them apprised of the situation and, show your dedication and commitment to the fund and the fact that things are being done on the ground. It's important that you keep them updated to avoid, any future mismatch of expectations, which are definitely going to arise as this sort of year rolls out.
Okay. So the next question is from Pratik. Are you seeking clarity on the audit requirement from SEBI, whether it is prospective in nature or is it applicable to existing funds?
Yes. So, we are seeking clarity and we are asking, all sort of AIFs also to seek this clarity, because it just helps the cause if the industry participants who are the fund managers who are actually going to be doing this, they sort of, take this up with SEBI. Obviously, they're going to come back and say it's an internal requirement and we cannot see. I mean, from their perspective, it's going to be very difficult to lay down a timeline, so to speak, that, if you've done an initial close and from initial close within 6 months, say, for example, you have to, do the audit, or within 8 months to do a report. So it might be difficult from their perspective, which is probably why they have also left it sort of open-ended. But definitely, we have also requested, all the fund managers who deal with AIFs to raise this directly with SEBI and try to, sort of build up, the requirement that, this is critical to clarify, because a lot of people have this question. So we have also made representations and we have also requested our clients to make the same.
And there is one question from Anuba, the audit fee, like what will be the audit fee?
See, I think what I'm seeing is that most people are not really engaging third party for it, because just to engage a third party, give them all the information, because ultimately, say, for example, you engage us, you will be asking you a whole host of questions on the portfolio level. We'll be mapping it with the term sheet. We will be asking, I mean, there will be a lot of, time that will go in. So what I am seeing most people adopt is actually just get their compliance officer internally to do the audit. Or if you have a company secretary who does your CTR filings and who does your day-to-day sort of, issuance of notices, doing quarterly reports, whoever is more involved on the ground is being asked to do this audit as well. So I don't really know what are the third-party fees which are being charged for this. It's very case to case. See, again, it depends on the corpus of the fund. It depends on the kind of the kind of terms that you have in your PPM. So it's not really a one size fits all answer.
Yes, so that was the last question.
Okay.
Yeah, would you like to add anything on the questions which were asked, or any input?
I'm happy for Vivek and Atreya to sort of sum up the session, and if they have any key takeaways or anything that they want to leave the participants with.
No, I think Pallavi, you've covered the questions well, and I think importantly, internal auditor is, because a lot of questions were around the audit process. The internal auditor is something SEBI has permitted. So I would think a lot of funds, as you rightly mentioned, would be really going into with that option, at least for this leg of the compliance.
Nothing further to add from my perspective.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you, Atreya. Thank you, Vivek, for the session. It was nicely covered, and thanks everyone to join in on Saturday evening, as Pallavi said, and stay safe.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.